In this video, I will show 7 common landscape photography editing mistakes that you definitely want to avoid. When I talk about mistakes, I mean unwarranted mistakes. So on the one hand, you have your own style, which I of course respect, but on the other hand, you have all those mistakes that you cannot hide behind. This is my art and I want to edit the photos the way I please. So these mistakes are very common. It is some I see a lot when I browse through photos either on Facebook or Instagram. However, I always show my own photos in these videos, so I wanted to mix it up a little bit. Through my post-processing course, I also have a Facebook group and I asked the members to submit photos that they wanted to get a little bit of feedback on. So I got more than 100 photos and I've crammed all those photos down to these 7 common landscape photography editing mistakes that you want to avoid. So before we get into it, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe if you want to see even more videos, and hit the bell notification and select all to see all my videos so that YouTube does not select the videos for you. So without further ado, let's get into the first mistake. I'm of course going to show how to fix these mistakes, and I'm going to do it in Adobe Photoshop and Adobe CameraRaw. If you're using Lightroom or any other program, you can of course also follow along. They are kind of the same and you kind of end up doing the same mistakes in editing no matter the program. So let's get into it. So the first mistake is to not get rid of all the essential small mistakes, such as crooked horizons, which is the case in this one. So we'll just go in and fix it here. You just go to the crop and rotate tab and then the straighten tool and just click somewhere along what's perceived as the horizon. There we go. Very easy fix. The same is in the case in this one. Beautiful shot from Iceland. So let's just fix the horizon like this. And now we have a pretty good horizon. Another thing that is really important to fix is dust spots. So you can see here, these are sensor dust spots. And here and here. That's a rather easy way to fix it. And we have another example here with even more sensor dust spots. So you just go into the spot removal tool. You can either press on the visual spot, and it doesn't really work that well in this example here. If we go back to the other example, we can see it better. They are always these circles here and here. However, in this example, where it doesn't really work with visualize spots, we just go back into edit, just crank up the dehaze, and then we can really easily see these dust spots. And then we can use the spot removal tool and just select them. If these spots are in a place with a lot of texture, it can be a little bit harder to use the spot removal tool. So let's go into Photoshop and finish up this one here instead. So now that we're in Photoshop, we can just zoom into our dust spots. And you can see we have one over here and we have something here. So I just make a new layer and then I use my clone stamp tool at a relatively low flow, and then I just select a little bit from above. There we go, away with this one and away with this one. And I know we also have one over here, so we can just select a little bit there and just paint on top. So that's a very simple way to also remove dust spots. So the next mistake is to use too heavy vignettes. So vignettes are usually something you want to avoid because it's an optical mistake in your lens. You can use them artistically, however, if they become distracting, they become a problem. So in this first example here, it's not too bad, but if we zoom out, we can actually really see that there is a lot of vignetting going on right here. The same one in this example here. It kind of looks unnatural because this is not how light would behave in reality, and we can kind of like really easily see that it's a vignette. Same goes for this one here. Again, it is just distractingly dark out here in the corners relative to the rest of the scene. Same goes for this one here. It's not so bad in this one. In this one here, it really comes across that there's a lot of vignetting here. So what I mean is that the gradation from out here where it's dark to where it's bright is simply just too hard. It happens too sudden. Like this phenomenon, you wouldn't see this in reality. So be careful how you apply vignettes. When you work with vignettes in Photoshop or CameraRaw or Lightroom, you can of course go down here to turn on your use profiles corrections and then play around with the vignette here. And I usually think that CameraRaw and Lightroom has a tendency to overcompensate a little bit, so I can pull it back a little bit. Or you can go all the way down here to effects, and then you can add some vignettes. You can see here, this is just, it's way too much. It looks super distracting. It would never look like this in reality. But if you really want to darken down those corners, just use the feather tool down here. I usually just crank it all the way up, and then you can always put the midpoint further in. If you want to respect the highlights, you can use this highlight slider down here. In that way, you pull back the effect of the vignetting from the highlights. So that is one way to soften up your vignettes, but generally be very, very careful that you don't overdo vignettes. Now, probably the biggest mistake or problem I see in all editing, modern editing, digital editing, is halos and white lines around high contrast areas. You can see here along these poles, there's this white line going all the way up. It almost looks like chromatic aberration. And in this example too here, when we zoom in, you can see white lines along these poles here. And when we zoom in here, this is like overly processed, but it's a good example here because we can really see along this church tower here, just white lines, along all these towers. So be very, very careful of that. And Werner, I know that you can do a proper job here because you have this shot here with the tree. And it's a really great example because usually trees can be hard to edit. And you have done it really, really well here. There's a little bit of haloing going on down here, but it's not as bad as in the two former examples. In this example here from Boris, be careful up here. We have the foreground, which is relatively bright, and then suddenly it becomes dark, and then we have the sky coming in, and then we get all these halos along the trees. So this is probably some kind of blending you have made where you have had a darker exposure and then maybe just put it in without using a proper luminosity mask. I of course show how to do that in my Photoshop course, so you might want to rewatch that one. Else, for all of you who are not in my course, I have a very brief, very fast introduction to luminosity masks you can see via the link up in the corners here. And you can see also here, it's not too bad in this example here, but we do have a little bit of haloing, white haloing going on here. In this example here, we also have some haloing going on down here. I don't know if it's some clarity that has been pushed up a little bit, but it does look a little bit off along here. And this one here, if we really zoom out, it becomes visible. You can see it here along the rock right here. It's not too bad, but just be aware of it. There is also the risk of making darker halos. So you can see here around these two humans that there's this kind of dark halo shadow thing going on. It happens sometimes when you process your photos really, really hard, which is the case here with really hard contrast, that those pop. You can always compensate for it by just painting in a little bit brighter. So let's zoom in here and just paint in a little bit brighter around them. It's very simple to compensate for. So before and after. And you see it's almost gone. So these halos usually happen if you just like crank up the shadows, bring down the highlights, and let's just bring some exposure in and some contrast, maybe a little bit of clarity. So it's not too bad in this example, but you can see that up here along the church tower, it's a little bit darker and around. And if we zoom in, we start getting this white line here along the tower. And if we increase some sharpening, you can really see it. So generally be very, very careful of that and use luminosity masking. This is where you want to use luminosity masking. It is to avoid these HDR effects. So the easiest way to fix these very grim white lines along buildings and poles and generally high contrast areas is simply to get into Photoshop, where I am right now. So just make a new layer, change the blending mode to darken, go to your clone stamp tool. You can take the flow up to 100% and just select, hold down Alt, select a little bit outside of wherever you want to remove the halo or the line, and just paint on top of it. So in that way we are only painting, due to the darken blending mode of the layer, where the photo is brighter, which is of course the line. So that is the easiest way to do it. Make sure that you are a little bit careful that you don't darken down more than you actually want to darken down. But generally this is the easiest way to fix this. So the next mistake is that you do not respect the light, and the sky is simply just too dark compared to the foreground. So in this first example here, we can see that the sky, that is your light source. And then suddenly it becomes dark here along the top of the mountains, and then it becomes brighter again down here. And of course there can be some mist and some fog, that's all good, but this here looks like a typical gradient filter, either from a gradient filter on your camera or in Lightroom. And if I just go in and try to compensate for it, you can see it starts to look much more natural. The gradation from the sky and down to the ground. What you probably would want to do is darken down the shadows a little bit here, maybe darken down the overall highlights, and then bring in a little bit of contrast, and then maybe only apply a little bit of lower exposure to the upper sky, something like this here. In that way you get around this really hard gradation, which it looks like a gradient filter. This example here, so again we can see how the sky is just darker than what's reflected in it here. Just remember that generally when we have reflections of something, the reflection is usually always the darker part of the photo. So you really need to take that into consideration when you darken down the sky and there's a reflection. It is the same in this example here. We have a very dark sky, but the reflection is brighter. That's not how it looks in reality. So in this photo here from Lars, we have our light source here in the background, and our light source should always be the brightest part of the photo, and it arguably is. But the problem is we suddenly have a very, very bright part right here in the middle, which is like mainly white or colder than our light source. And that looks a little bit unnatural. So generally, you cannot have your main light source to be darker than the ground, which it is lighting up. That doesn't make any sense. So you have to respect the light in that regard. In this example here from Nick, really, really great example. Here he respects the light. So even though it is probably has a bit of processing to it, at least a lot of contrast, we have our light source here in the background. It is not crammed in. There's a nice gradation from the blown out highlights, which is fine. You are more than welcome to blow out highlights. But from here where the sun is, and then into the yellows here and around. And even here on the rocks, it's blown out, but it's fine. It looks natural. And then we have the main light hitting here in the foreground. The only one thing I would suggest is maybe just like a crop, but yeah, something like this here. Because then we get rid of most of that sky that doesn't really add too much. But besides that, beautiful photo, Nick. So the next mistake I often see is that the photographer does not get the tones right in editing. Here I'm talking about either a too flat photo, a too contrasty photo. It can be blown out highlights, or it can be clipped shadows, or maybe some wrong dodge and burning that again does not respect the light. In this photo here, a beautiful morning, I would suggest to just give it some contrast. I bring down the darks a little bit here and maybe bring up the whites. So in this way, we see a little bit more of the texture. So this here, I would say, was too flat initially. Here in this example, also a little bit too flat here in the foreground. So just make a simple gradient filter and bring in some contrast to the foreground. In that way, we also make the path stand out a little bit more. It's not a whole lot it does, but as you can see, it looks a little bit more natural like this. Here, the waterfall here, and they can be notoriously hard to get right, but it is a little bit blown out. And I can't really restore it because it's a JPEG file, but just really be careful of these blown out highlights. Up here in the clouds, also it seems as if they're blown out. There's not really any details up there. If you obviously have the raw file, you can bring it down a little bit up there. And here in the background, there are some details here, but they are just about being blown out. I would like those details to be there too. So obviously you can like use a radial filter or whatever, bring down the exposure a little bit and just add it in there. So in that way we can see a little bit more of the details. In this very high contrast example here, and generally high contrast, like it is a certain style, and of course you can blow out the highlights and clip the shadows. Just be aware if that is actually what you want, because you are losing a lot of details in the shadows and in the highlights here. So maybe not that much contrast, but then again, it's very subjective. This is here where it's like personal style over editing mistakes. In this example here, we have our light source here. We know the sun is somewhere up here. It's not out here over the ocean. So down here on the house, it is suddenly brighter on the backside, yet over here it's darker. So there's some kind of dodging which doesn't really look natural. So be very careful of dodging and burning so it gets to look natural. What I would do here to fix it is just to bring down the exposure a little bit. And there we go. So now it looks a little bit more natural. And then I would bring up the shadows of the entire photo in another way, use some luminosity masking and stuff, because we really do not want our photos to look unnatural. And in this example here from Sandros, again, it's all about respecting that light. We have very, very hard vignetting, and the vignetting is actually making the sun darker, and the sun is obviously the most bright light source we have, but the sun is darker than the light over here. We cannot have that. I know, Sandro, this is one of your bad edits. You said so yourself. But it's a great example that the light source and the tones are not respected. So this example here, also from you, Sandros, it's actually not too bad, even though you say it's one of your bad edits. It's maybe just a little bit underexposed, a little bit too dark. If you just bring up the exposure, you're fine. And this one here is not as bad as you think it is. And here, I can't really point to anything. Maybe it looks like a little bit of a crooked horizon, but generally, this is really nicely edited in regard to tones and so forth. Nice contrast. So the sixth mistake I often see is that a photo is not cleaned properly. So all these small distractions down here, I probably wouldn't get rid of all of them, but just most of them. In this case here, it's a beautiful photo, but my eyes are just brought down here in the corner. Just get rid of this distraction here. You can do it in Photoshop with any kind of cleaning tool. And in this one up here, whoopsie, I think you forgot something up here in the corner. Probably some electricity line, power line or something like that. But besides that, really, really beautiful photo. So the last mistake is just wrong colors, oversaturation, and HDR-ish effects. So the first example here, we have some purple colors here in the shadows, and the general feelings with the photo is very high contrast, and it just looks, yeah, over the top. It's, in my humble opinion, not really aesthetic. So really be careful of these purple colors here in the shadows. In this example here, it's just overly processed in regard to clarity. It looks to me, and contrast. It gets that HDR feeling. It can be a style, fair enough, but you take out a lot of the natural parts of the photo. So I would personally really pull all of these sliders back here. Can add a little bit of contrast, but a little bit too much dehazing. I know what you're going for. I know you want to show all these beautiful light streaks coming out from behind the cloud, but there are other ways to do that. Be very, very careful that you don't overuse the dehaze slider and the clarity slider, because it just makes the photo look HDR-ish and very unnatural. So in this last example here, way too many colors, way too saturated colors. There's probably a market for it, but I would definitely pull back the saturation slider a lot. Like it stones like this, it's just too much, too red, it's too blue, looks super unnatural. It almost looks like luminosity plankton, but I guess this is taken at like sunset. So definitely pull that saturation slider way back. And yeah, I'm not sure what more can really be done here. It's just too hard out with the dehaze. Yeah, so really over saturated. Be careful not to add too many colors. So this was of course only a small selection of those 100 photos that I got in the folder, and admittedly most of those photos were really good. Great work, guys. These were just the very worst examples that I could find, and you have probably edited these photos before you started my course. I most certainly hope so. So if some of you guys out there haven't enrolled in my Photoshop for Landscape Photographers course and learn how I edit my photos, then there is a discount code down in the description, 15% off, that you can use. And until next time, I would highly appreciate both a like and a comment, and I hope you all learned something from these 7 examples.